I'm going to hop over and take a look at a model for writing. Let me just clean this up really fast. I made the first recording and forgot to turn on the recording volume. So let's do take 2. So this is a philosophy paper that was written by a grad student in the department, I believe, when they were an undergrad. It's going to have a slightly different structure than your paper, but it's still very, very close to the structure that we're looking for and the way to approach writing a philosophy paper. Writing a philosophy paper is different than writing a history paper, a book report, or something even for a poli-sci class. We're dealing with arguments here, and we want to be able to say what the argument is and also what reasons stand in support of that argument, and then unpack those reasons for the reader. But let's take a look at the first sentence here. The first sentence says, and this is in the argument section, in this paper, I will argue that the use of interrogational torture is immoral because it violates the worth and dignity that all humans deserve by using them as means to an end. This is the thesis statement for the paper. This is the statement in the paper that tells us what the paper is supposed to be about. Note that it's also the first sentence. You don't need to add anything like from the beginning of time, people have wondered whether blah, blah, blah. We don't need fluff. Fluff is good for kittens. Fluff is not good for philosophy papers. You also don't have enough words for fluff right now. Get straight to the point. Tell us what it is that this paper is going to be about. You'll notice that the author here used an I statement. You're allowed to use I in philosophy. However, for your paper, you're telling us what somebody else believes. So your first sentence might not have an I statement in it. Your first sentence might be something along the lines of, well, what you wrote for the Prezi. In insert paper here, author so-and-so argues that blah, blah, blah. And notice that I used the word argument. And indeed, this author also uses the word argument. We're not looking for explanations here. The author isn't explaining something to us. They're arguing for a specific position. And we want you to tell us what that position is. What is it that Savulescu is trying to convince us of? Let's continue. Sentence 2, torture is immoral because it disregards people's humanity by treating them as tools to obtain information, as stated in Kant's categorical imperative, quote, blah, blah, blah. So you will notice that this author used a quote. We aren't using quotes in your paper. Do not give us quotes. And then it says, in theory, the goal of interrogational torture is to attain information from prisoners so that the mission of tortures may be advanced. All of this stuff is background information of a sort. It's background information that the reader would need to know in order to understand some of the technical nuances of the paper. For example, if the categorical imperative is playing a big role in this author's understanding of dignity, well, we're going to want the readers to know what the categorical imperative is. We also are going to want to know what is interrogational torture. That hasn't been defined. So for your paper, in the event that there are anything that we call technical terms or terms that somebody reading your paper might need to know a little bit more about to understand what's going on, you're invited to give us a brief explanation of what those are. You might not need to for this paper, but for some papers, especially if there are technical terms or terms that you're using in a way that might not be used in common language. For example, here's an example that you won't be using in your paper. Principle of charity. Charity means something very different in common discourse than it does in this case, the principle of charity. The principle of charity is actually what we're asking you to use for this paper, but I'll explain that later. To summarize, if you encounter technical terms or notions that a reader would need to know more about to understand the rest of the paper, this is the space to define them. And in this argument section, that's what this author has done. Let's continue. However, to obtain this information, the torturers disregard the humanity of the prisoners by using them as mere means to further their own agenda. What this is doing is this is a sentence that stands in support of the author's argument. That is, it explains why the author thinks that interrogational torture is an instance where prisoners are used as means to an end. For your paper, This would be the sense where you tell us one of the reasons that Savulescu gives that he believes leads to his conclusion, that leads to his argument being true. So let's call this a reason. Let's call this reason 1. In theory, let's call this reason 1. In practice, I need to close this out for a second. Please hold. And it looks like it had a bad day. So some of my marks are gone. Sorry about that. So let's call this reason 1. Let's call this background information. Let me adjust the brightness. That might be part of the problem. So let's call that reason 1. Let's call that background information. So as I was saying, for your paper, this would be the point where you give us one of the reasons that Savulescu gives in support of his argument. And then the next sentence, since interrogational torture uses prisoners as means to an end, quote, torture is a clear violation of the dignity of the victim and as such a violation of the categorical imperative, end quote. This is an explanation of sorts. It's an explanation that is expanding on the reason to tell the reader a little bit more why this reason stands in support of the argument. That is, why is this a reason to believe the author's position? Telling us that so-and-so has a reason isn't enough to motivate that reason for your reader. You need to explain it a little bit more. Continuing on, also the effects of torture go beyond the pain inflicted at a specific time to certain prisoners, as torture undermines the dignity of prisoners. So this is what we can call reason 2. This is the second reason that stands in support of the author's argument. It is supposed to provide further proof that prisoners are treated as means rather than ends. And then notice immediately after this, we get another explanation. We get another explanation that expands and unpacks this reason and tells us why it stands in support of the argument. So that's kind of the structure that, all things considered, your paper should follow. This is slightly different because it's using different content. It's about torture, it's about somebody's own personal view, but in general, this is a decent structure and it's a good structure for a philosophy paper. What this goes on to do afterwards is to look at an objection. You do not need to do that for your paper. We're not asking for any objections yet. That's going to be for a later paper and a later assignment. But right now, what I want to do briefly is kind of summarize a possible approach to writing this paper. You don't need to use this structure. There are plausibly other ways that you could do it, but this is one that folks might find helpful as a starting point. So the first thing that we want to make sure that folks have is a thesis statement. The thesis statement is telling us what it is the paper is going to be about. In this case, what is it that the author is arguing for? So Arthur blah 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 argues blah 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 blah. You need to tweak that a little bit, but that's the general thing. The first thing you want is a thesis statement. In other papers, you would write in this essay I, but in this case, you're telling us what somebody else is arguing for their position. So workshop that as best as you can. The second thing that we're going to want you to do is make sure that you clarify any terms that need clarification. There might not be terms that need clarification in this paper, or there might be. It's going to be something that you're going to have to decide. But are there things that a common reader who has never read Savulescu before might need unpacked for them a little bit? If not, then we're going to want to hear about the reasons. And by reasons, I mean, what are some of the things that Savulescu points to that supports his central thesis and stands as, in this case, the motivation for thinking that his argument leads to certain conclusions? We can also call this, why should I believe Savulescu. Why should I believe him as a reader? What are some of the reasons that he gives as to why his conclusions are true? And then we also need to see you explain. Specifically explain the reasons. Simply stipulating, that's the word, simply stipulating that somebody has reason X for conclusion Y doesn't really work to motivate that reason all that well. You need to give your reader some additional information about the reason. For example, since I use this example in my classes with respect to food ethics, if somebody is arguing in favor of veganism and they start with claims about production practices, they need to give us a reason to think that consumption practices follow claims about production practices. It wouldn't be enough for them to say, well, here's a reason. Consumption practices follow from production practices. But why? Why is it the case that these things point to those things following from the other things? So make sure you explain the reasons. Give additional examples. Try to clarify any terms that come up, but really try to motivate things on behalf of the author. And 5, maybe a concluding sentence. In larger papers, you'll have a concluding paragraph that summarizes what it is that you've argued for, things that maybe you would consider in a longer paper, additional projects that could follow or would be tangential to some of the things that you discussed, but you don't got time for that. You have 350 words to finish this assignment. But having a concluding sentence or 2 that wraps up some of the things would be nice if you have space to be able to fit those in. So this is a possible structure. You don't necessarily have to use this structure, but all things considered, this might be one that would help you achieve the targets and the expectations as outlined in the rubric of having an organization and a presentation of the ideas. You want to be able to present the ideas from the paper in a way that's going to be intelligible for your reader, especially a reader who has never read Savulescu. And this is a way to make sure that the flow of the paper follows appropriately, that you can start with ideas and concepts and the argument, and then transition into the reasons to support the argument, expand and explain what it is that those reasons say and how it is that they're supposed to work, and that way your reader can see what's going on. If you have additional questions after listening to this video, be sure to reach out to your TA and to let them know of anything else that you want clarified. Also be sure to read through your TA's emails that have gone out about frequently asked questions, and also to take a look at the resources available on Canvas. There are a number of resources that we have up right now about how to write philosophy, and a number of folks might find that those are very helpful and can give examples of philosophy that you'll be able to use and try to workshop to figure out how to structure your paper.